discussion on what's going on in Bakhmut. So a couple days ago I talked about the potential withdrawal of Ukrainian forces. I said briefly that there's a chance they could reinforce. Well, the calculus has changed apparently in the city, as the Ukrainians aren't necessarily doing a full reinforcement, but they are reinforcing enough that they find holding the city for a little bit longer to be of strategic value. Now, the reason for this isn't necessarily the city itself, it's the implications for the Russians on trying to hold the city, or trying to take the city, from the Ukrainians. The U.S. Department of Defense has assessed that the Russians are losing soldiers and Wagner Group private military contractors at a rate of 5-1 to Ukraine. That's significant. That's not necessarily making the land itself strategically valuable, it's making the relative losses from Russia strategically significant. And the reason the Ukrainians seem to have surged not an entire killing blow's worth of forces to Bakhmut to drive the Russians away, but rather enough of a force to continue holding the city, to drag the fighting on long enough to make it more painful for Russia. The reason for this is the Ukrainians discovered that in an effort to get Bakhmut taken quicker, Russia pushed its airborne forces, its VDV forces, or VDV if you are in Russia, but their VDV forces to Bakhmut. When that became apparent, Ukraine saw that as a potential to further attrit what is considered their elite units, the Russian elite units in those airborne forces. Additionally, Russia committed some units from its 1st Tank Guard, which is one of their more advanced elite tank units. And I say elite with quotes heavily. These are units that have lost significant amounts of ground over time. So that's why we're seeing Bakhmut still in Ukrainian hands with fierce urban fighting. The urban fighting actually lends itself to the defense, and it seems Ukraine is wanting to attrit more Russians. Now, there's a fine line here where the Ukrainians don't want to commit so many forces and so much equipment that it subsequently hinders any future counteroffensives they may be planning, which we anticipate in the May-June timeframe. But they also want to weaken the Russian forces enough so that said counteroffensive in May or June is more successful or easier to accomplish, because the Russians are weakened, their equipment has been destroyed, they have less ammunition. And that's what's happening in Bakhmut right now for Ukraine with regard to the Russians. The other thing is, it is no secret that the head of the Wagner Group, Prigozhin, has said openly, even yesterday, that he is pissed with the Kremlin, and the Ukrainians see further weakening Wagner Group as a way to drive a greater wedge between the private military company and the Kremlin. The Kremlin needs Wagner Group in Bakhmut right now. If Wagner Group is destroyed, or they just go home, or they are further attrited to such a level that they can't continue operations and continue to frustrate them, it will continue to drive that wedge. And the Ukrainians see what Prigozhin is saying about the Kremlin as an information campaign against Russia, and it's a very effective one, actually. Their own military contractor is saying bad things about the people who are contracting them. It is absolutely a strategic information campaign to continue to hit Wagner Group. Side note on that, there's a U.S. interest in having Wagner Group also be weakened because of their global presence in places like Africa and Syria. They are a nuisance. They are a rogue mercenary group that is supported by Russia to do Russia's bidding overseas, and the further they are weakened, the more likely they're going to be weakened globally, and they can essentially be removed from the global scene. So there is a sense of, even though we've seen many U.S. military generals say a withdrawal is the smartest option, having them continue to deplete Wagner Group forces And what is even if they're using inmates, it is a limited pool of inmates. Having them further deplete that is only good for the entire world. And essentially it is Ukraine, and I don't think they're going about it like this, but the Ukrainians are doing a favor to the Western world by weakening Wagner Group in Ukraine, which means they're weakened globally. It also drives that wedge between Prigozhin and the Kremlin, and he is very vocal and loves to talk shit about the Kremlin when his folks aren't getting what they need, and that only helps with driving the information campaign. So with that being said, it definitely seems like the Ukrainians are going to continue to stick it out in Bakhmut at least for a little bit longer. They've bolstered their flanks, strengthened their ability to conduct operations in urban warfare. They aren't committing heavy equipment that they're going to need in any kind of offensive operation in the future. So a withdrawal likely will eventually come if Russia is able to regroup and drive them out. But make no mistake, Bakhmut is it for Russia. They will culminate, that's my telling me there's someone on my side when I'm trying to turn here, but they will culminate when Bakhmut is done. They have nothing more. They can't fight after this. They have to re-equip and refit. Well, as many experts have said, even if Russia takes Bakhmut, it may have been at a very costly moment in the war where Ukraine is ramping up to conduct a counteroffensive in late spring, and that is going to eventually, you may win the battle, but you may have lost the war essentially. As I said a week ago or so, what I think the Ukrainian counteroffensive looks like is they push southwards to Melitopol to drive a wedge between the Russian mainland and Crimea and the whole Kherson Oblast, and from there we'll see what happens. But make no mistake, Russia sees Bakhmut not as a strategic victory on the battlefield. It is absolutely a strategic victory for Putin's political and war continuing aspirations. And as it's going right now, it's still going very, very poorly for the Russians. They're trading hundreds of troops for a few meters of ground in urban warfare at this point, and it is going to continue to be a struggle for Russia. And it might be the nail in their coffin, where there's a turning point when the weather warms up in Ukraine, and Ukraine is now fighting a severely depleted and weakened Russia who committed so many forces to Bakhmut for a political victory. And now Ukraine, with its Western training, its Western equipment, are going to come in and sweep down, much like they did in Kharkiv, much like they did in Kherson. And it's going to get real ugly for Russia.